In seminary, I was told we should not talk about the sermon writing process as part of our sermon. The sermon is about God and not about the sermon or the person delivering the sermon. Yet it seems as if today's lesson calls for a special commentary on writing this sermon. When I approach writing a sermon, one of the first things I think about is where is the good news in the lesson for the day. And today's lesson, it can be challenging to find the good news. And I'd like to look at how we understand the lesson from the context of the people of Jesus' time, as well as from the context of today. So let's look for a moment at marriage. The idea of marriage has changed an awful lot since 2,000 years ago in Israel. Today, we think of people marrying for love, not as an arranged marriage, a child marriage, but joining out of love. And this has opened up our approach to marriage. Back then, marriage was the joining of families for the protection and welfare of children. And today, it is much more about that celebration of love, of joining people together in God's love. That's one of the reasons why we found a change in our tradition to accept same-sex marriages, because people of the same sex can and do love one another as much as people of different sexes. It's also why we see the divorce rate what it is today. According to recent statistics, 50% of marriages in the United States end in divorce. My parents divorced, and it was very painful. My first marriage ended in divorce, and it was very painful. So, where is the good news in today's lesson? Because the pain that I've experienced individually is one that I suspect many of us have experienced, and many even more painful. It is worth noting that October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and there are many people in great pain because of failed marriages. So where is the good news? Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. How do we approach this? Another verse that jumps out at me is the verse where it says, God made them male and female. And these days, I wonder about those people who don't identify themselves as male or female. It may be genetically because of having 3 chromosomes being intersex. It may be because of not feeling that they were born with the gender that they truly are. How do we approach this verse in a way that welcomes non-binary people? Recently, I came across a quote that actually put it into a very wonderful perspective. See, God did create humans, male and female, just as God separated the day from the night. There's a fellowship in Bible group that some of us are part of, that recently Eric Reddy talked about the golden hour of the day, the first light of the day, which is so special. The light travels through, sort of horizontally through the atmosphere. It's golden and it's wonderful. And it's a reminder that it isn't a clear cut, it's night and then it's day, but there's a transition. And the same thing at dusk, the gloaming hour, as the day fades away. There is a beauty, not only in the night and the day, but in everything in between. And yesterday, we celebrated creation. And part of God's creation story is that God separated the water from the dry land. But anyone who's really interested in the beauty of our world knows the importance of those places in between, the marshes, the estuaries, teeming of life. And again, we have water, dry land, and some of the beauty that happens in between. So we need to look at the verse, God made them male and female, and think about some of the beauty in between. So, where does the verse go with all of this? It leads us to Jesus talking about welcoming children. And I would like to invite you for one moment to close your eyes and think about the children that you think about when you hear this verse. If you're like me, you're probably thinking of somebody like Shirley Temple with beautiful blonde curls, faithfully attending Sunday school. But again, that's not the context of Jesus' story. If we look at the role of children in New Testament Israel, they were a possession on the same level practically as animals or slaves. They were among the least privileged. So when we think about this verse, about welcoming children, I invite you to think about the least privileged. Perhaps the least privileged children of today. Those who have been placed in cages in the borders of our country. Those who are refugees fleeing from Afghanistan or Syria or other parts of tumult in our country. Or perhaps thinking more broadly of God's children as those who are homeless, who have substance use disorders, who have formerly been incarcerated. How do we welcome all of God's children? Stephanie Stellers has a wonderful book called Radical Welcome. And she asks this very question, pushing it to the boundaries, to where it becomes challenging to us. Do we welcome the most vulnerable children of God in our church to be members of committees, to be members of the vestry? And here in Connecticut, the diocese is looking for a new bishop. Are we listening for the voices of God's most vulnerable children as we search for a new bishop? Would we consider for our new bishop someone who has been divorced, who has been homeless, who has had a substance use disorder, So, where does this leave us? I would like to suggest that this passage today about marriage and divorce is really about joining and separating. Yesterday, the Amistad visited Middletown. And for those who don't know the story, the Amistad was a slave ship in 1839 that the slaves rebelled. The ship was brought to New Haven, and the trial of whether or not these slaves should be sold as merchandise captured when the ship was captured or tried for murder became a giant trial which was an important part of the beginning of the abolition movement. What can we learn from the history of the Amistad? These were God's most vulnerable children who were separated from their homeland, from their families, for the personal gain of the traders, of the slave traders. And how do we separate people today for our personal gain? And what is the alternative? The alternative, I would like to suggest, can be found in another event from yesterday. Yesterday, we gathered to remember Anna Ross. And during the eulogies, people spoke of her deep kindness and her great respect for every person, and how she made people feel welcome. This is, I believe, what today's gospel is calling us to. That we are to welcome one another, to welcome the most downtrodden, the most underprivileged. And for the good news is that we, in our brokenness, I in my divorce, each one of us, in whatever ways we are hurt, we are lacking privilege, the good news is that God's love for us, which made it possible for Anne to be so welcoming, makes it possible for us to also be so welcoming. And that God welcomes us, including the divorced and the least privileged, with a loving welcome greater even than Anne's welcome. We would do well to be a little more like Anne and draw a little closer to God in welcoming all children. The collect for today reminds us God is always more willing to give than we deserve or desire, and to pour out abundance of mercy on all of us. Amen.
Amen.